Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Mark. We must have met, I guess, at that first workshop many years ago. Yeah, and your work, particularly on agent-based models, has been very inspirational for what we do. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how you're contributing to clinical trial design.
Thank you. All right. So yes, I'll talk about briefly some of the work we've been doing in the last 5 to 6 years, doing evolutionary therapy at Moffitt, and essentially the aspect of using virtual patients or digital twins, or what we're calling patient avatars, to guide therapy for both individuals and also for thinking about trial design and predicting the outcomes thereof. So we have at Moffitt a couple of pilot clinical trials which have implemented what we call the evolutionary tumor board, which is essentially an extension of the traditional tumor board concept where oncologists and other physicians will gather to discuss individual patient cases where there's no clear pathway and there might be multiple choices of what to do, or they've sort of been through the standard choices and figure out what to do next. And so in the evolutionary tumor board, essentially we brought into that process data analysis, math modeling, evolutionary theory, and physical-based modeling to bring more information to these decisions, which sometimes are made from a more intuitive clinical perspective, but this can add, quantitative weight to the analysis of why you choose to do something. So in green, up here on the right, is a traditional patient journey. Once they get diagnosed, they have their data that contributes to, putting them on a certain treatment pathway. Decisions will be made about treatment with the patient and the clinician. Those treatments will be implemented. There will be follow-up data. And then that loop continues where you continue, either the existing treatment or make modifications, switch to new treatments, et cetera. And so underlying it, we're bringing the blue parts, which are essentially predictive modeling, virtual patient, cohorts, essentially. Retrospective data is obviously key for this. And then assisting in the clinical decision process by offering additional information to that. So just a couple of examples from our ETB, or evolutionary tumor board. So on the left, we had a patient with osteosarcoma who came to us, and essentially they had resectable disease. So at the time they joined the tumor board, there was no evidence of disease for them. And they wanted to try cabozantinib, which at the time, a few years ago, was sort of minimally used for osteosarcoma. But there had been one trial, which is shown in the black PFS curve there. The issue was the patient wanted to know, how long should they be on this therapy, given they had no visible or measurable disease. And in this trial, everyone had non-resectable disease, and so widespread visible metastatic burden. And you could see that those patients essentially were on the cabozantinib for under 6 months on average. But this person had no evidence of disease, so we wanted to say, like, what were the expectations they could have, how long they might be on the cabozantinib, and also how long should they continue the cabozantinib, in the absence of progression. So we essentially took the published trial data along with our retrospective data on osteosarcoma, built out that virtual patient cohorts, reproduced the trial in the non-resectable case, and then redid the trial for this patient in the case where they had resectable and much smaller disease, using assumptions about upper limits of disease and so forth, and essentially produced the red curves, which are the patient-specific predictions for how long we would expect them to be on cabozantinib without progression. And each line is how long they would stay on the cabozantinib. So if they only stayed on it 6 months and stopped, this was their expected PFS curve. And then you can also see there are diminishing returns beyond staying on the cabozantinib for more than 2 years, at which point it was likely that the entire effect of that drug had been used, and they could probably stop without affecting the outcome. So initially they were thinking of stopping early, but this led them to stay on the cabozantinib for longer. And unfortunately, it seems like they did progress right around the 25-month mark in the end. So they did, move on from this therapy, but it did, offer additional information essentially that, gave them the confidence to stay on that drug longer despite potential side effects. Now, on the right is a different case, a triple negative breast cancer patient where a relatively new drug at the time, a few years ago, this conjugate called Enhertu was published and had, a doubling of the PFS in this very aggressive disease. And we had very little, again, retrospective data on it because it was new, but we had published trial data. We had our virtual cohorts in triple negative, and we were able to make a prediction for her based on where in the published PFS curve, which can range anything from 2 to 24 months of predicted PFS time, to say that she was most likely going to be close to the median for her particular data. So we used her retrospective data plus our virtual cohorts that were built out in that disease to refine that prediction, which helps with planning of, when would you take imaging and also thinking about what the next line of therapy would be for that case. All this is based on our MCAP data system, which was developed in the last 5 years at Moffitt. Essentially has been a very strong effort to curate multimodal data across all these different areas. And in the interest of time, can't really dig into that, but it has close to 1 million patients in it. And it's all, correlated by patient and can be pulled up, filtered and analyzed. And so we're essentially taking this database and transforming it into our own sort of mathematical modeling version of it, which is our essentially digital twins or patient avatars, which then form the foundation for drawing in cohorts to then do these analyses. And so that lets us link all these different modes and also then allows us to carry over all the other patient data that comes along from such a database as that, which would include demographic information, biomarkers, genetics, pathology, anything else that would be in there. Each digital, avatar is going to have all that information attached to it, which means not only can you do model-based predictions, but then you can do inclusion-exclusion criteria. You can, do other things with that data to search it statistically even, or using AI or, and carry both the modeling and those data sets together. And so our fundamental unit of like simulation then is becoming this like patient-based avatar, which is based on that retrospective data. And then we're pulling that together into cohorts now to do clinical trial simulation. So you can also use those cohorts for individual prediction, which is what we did for those 2 examples earlier. But just very quickly, we essentially tried to re-engineer, predict retrospectively the first adaptive therapy trial that was run at Moffitt, which started about 10 years ago now, which was, the adaptive abiraterone, which was, the first trial that ran. And so we took from our MCAP database, which has about 23,000 prostate cancer patients. We continued to filter that down to find patients retrospectively from that time period who would have been eligible for the trial but received continuous therapy, and applied a bunch of filtering and essentially came out with a set of candidate patients that was representative of the standard of care at the time, 10 years ago. And then using mathematical model, we essentially encoded those patients into virtual cohort of these digital avatars. And from that cohort, then we could simply apply the trial that we did. Now, all these patients only received continuous therapy. None of them received anything intermittent or adaptive. But we could then apply adaptive therapy based on the original trial protocol and compare the 2 arms. And so the outcome of that, agnostic to what actually happened in the trial, as much as possible, of course, was that we expected that using only continuous therapy data, the modeling suggested that we would have a significant increase in the PFS of that outcome. And of course, the real trial was equally successful in the sort of form of a tripling of the PFS. And this is in this PSA space. But more interesting in a way than just predicting the past is to think about, if we'd had this back then, could we have made some further adjustments to the protocol and continue to improve the outcomes? And so this was a concept of using like what is we're calling like this dynamic biomarkers, which is using the early stages of a treatment and math modeling to essentially further, segregate patients into different subarms. So here, 3 patients might come in, and based on their first cycle of their adaptive therapy, they could then be put into one of 3 groups where their threshold of deciding treatment on and off would be slightly different, but tailored to their own particular initial response. And if you do that, then you could continue to push out the expected benefit of the trial even further out to this green PFS curve, in this case, predicting we could have gotten an extra 6 months of benefit from that. And then the last vignette was doing something similar with looking at a lower dose in multiple myeloma and in combination with corticosteroids. And in the interest of time, I'll have to speed through this, but essentially we're using the cohorts to predict the trial outcome, but during trial execution. So this is a snapshot of that trial 1 year into it. It was a small trial and accrued rather slowly, so the year isn't so important, but you can see that only 7 patients have accrued up to this point in the trial. And statistically, you can't predict anything at that point because hardly anything has happened. But using our virtual cohorts, we're already getting somewhat of a good approximation of the final trial outcome, which lower right in blue. That's the statistical outcome of the trial. 2 years in, again, still statistics of the outcomes to date tell you nothing, but the virtual cohort is essentially predicting the median PFS time. And it's only 5 years after this trial began, after everybody has enrolled, that the 2 approaches are converging. So we're seeing much earlier ability to predict, at least in general, the median progression-free survival time for a trial in the execution phase. Because again, patients are accruing over time. It's not like you get everybody starting at day 0. So these virtual cohorts could be very valuable in sort of tracking your trial in that sense. So I'll stop there. There's a long list of people obviously who've contributed to this, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for keeping so well to time. So we have plenty of time for questions.
I don't know if that's some people. Thanks. That was really interesting. So digital twins, like super cool. And I love the connection of assessing the past using this technique. Are there existing or upcoming therapeutic approaches that you think would particularly benefit from the application of digital twins?
Yeah, so I think anything where there are, options in the design of a particular regimen, obviously all the evolutionary therapies are almost a mandatory place, and that's where we've started, of course. But even in like combinations, there's questions about timing, dosing. I think immunotherapy is another big one because of the complexity of the immune response and the time delays that are involved, and also the amount of sort of untapped biomarkers that exist in immunology, which are potentially tractable from blood draws and things like that. So I'd say those for me are the biggest areas we're looking at. It's combinations, immunotherapy, and evolutionary therapies. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I am always amazed at the ability to use multiple large data sets, especially from a hospital system, because sometimes the data input has changed over time. But I was wondering if there's any concern for demographic biases in your virtual patient cohort, given kind of the catchment area that is Moffitt and the cancer system versus other parts of the country, whether that would influence your virtual patient cohort.
Yeah, so certainly if you were trying to do this in a broader population, you would have to account for that. And that is something we're thinking about a lot because essentially right now we are basing it on our local population in-house, which is certainly biased demographically, but also biased by clinical sort of status. Obviously, a cancer center like Moffitt will see more advanced patients and, typically different sort of types of disease statuses than you would see in a community center or like an oncology group. So, the answer to that is basically more data from those either, demographic differences or also the, type of treating institution differences as well. So, that's obviously a tall order in some cases because acquiring that data can be difficult. So you have to be careful of your use case applications. That said, you can use ways to check, whether those demographic differences are contributing to the actual use case outcomes that you're examining by looking against broader sort of 10,000-foot view outcomes and seeing if at least those are reproducing. And then at that point, it's an assumption whether anything like below that level would also be sort of, irrelevant as far as that particular demographic difference. So.
Okay, we got time for another question.
I have another question on the cohort, which sounds like quite an amazing and formidable data set. But at the level of individual patient avatars, when you're looking at individual patients in this cohort of hundreds of thousands, many or most cancer patients die of metastasis, and often metastasis goes to different sites in the body. And those mets can have very different dynamics and characteristics. I'm just curious how much of that you think you may be capturing.
So for the evolutionary tumor board, we were, intentionally trying to account for that by looking for, cohorts that were specific and had, anatomical or physiological similarities. So, obviously different mets will behave different, locations for different diseases. So that could be a strong consideration, whether they've lymph node only or they've gone to the lungs, bones, et cetera. I think one of the challenges, obviously, as you say, there's a lot of variety. And so it's when you start adding so much variety, then your large numbers become more and more, diluted into small tree branches of who looks like who. So sometimes you do have to make assumptions. In the individual case, I think it's a little easier, but when you start talking about trials, then you are more concerned about representing a population correctly. Then I think that is something we're still looking into and figuring out how to address those differences. But that said, like these avatars include all phases of a person's journey. So often they will have, early, late stage in some cases. And so you can still select the portions of those elements and they still can contribute, at least partially to your question, even if you might have to ignore other potential aspects of their treatment journey because something happened to them that puts them off your use case. So.
Okay, well, thank you again, Mark.
Thank you.